Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Denise, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. I'm very excited to talk about my novel, The Tea Merchant. It is my first novel, and also to talk about the Boston Tea Party, which will be celebrating its 250th anniversary this December. So for those of you who haven't read The Tea Merchant yet, it is a work of historical fiction. Just to give a little bit of a premise, it's a little bit unusual for historical fiction, especially for one at this time. First of all, the protagonist is a woman. She is a widow. She is a tea merchant who has just inherited her late husband's tea shop, and now she's enjoying this newfound financial independence that she never had before. But secondly, she's also a little bit different because she comes from a loyalist family. So for those who aren't familiar, a loyalist family being one who is loyal to the crown, they support the government, they're friends with the governor. On the opposite side of that would be the Sons of Liberty at this time. They haven't fully become patriots yet, but they're on their way and voicing their opposition. So here we have this widow, her name is Constance Pruitt. She's having her great time as a tea merchant, but her parents, something I can relate to, want her to find something practical and settle down in life. You know, it's always nice to have a comfortable life with a husband who'll take care of you. And she says, no thanks, I'm gonna keep struggling and being a tea merchant. And so despite all the struggles, she goes ahead, she realizes she needs to supplement her income because things are starting to change in the empire. Things are getting a little bit turbulent in her industry, particularly around the Boston Tea Party's time. So instead, she turns to the Sons of Liberty. She's being pretty practical herself and becomes a smuggler for them and eventually becomes a spy for them. But as things get more and more dangerous, there are new threats that begin to emerge from the empire, and it becomes extremely dangerous for her. But eventually she has to face a choice. Is she going to go down this dangerous path, or is she going to pick something more practical? And her choice will actually, in the end, change the shape of the empire. But before we get there, I thought it'd be helpful to kind of step back and think about the Boston Tea Party itself. It's a big moment. It's a relevant moment. There was a piece in the Washington Post today about the Boston Tea Party and the Hutchinson letters, which are actually featured right in the start of the book as well. So that's a very practical time to go through it. So we'll start off with a little bit of history, then we'll dive into the book, what makes it different, and then hopefully we'll have an open conversation. I'm leaving some time at the end for us to talk about it, but please feel free to follow up with any questions or comments or insights. I know we have a couple of tax experts and history buffs over here as well, so feel free to chime in. So before we do that, let's just dive right in. So we've got the Boston Tea Party. Like I said, it happened 250 years ago. It'll happen this December 16th in 1773. There'll be a lot of events that are building up to it in Boston today. But just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the Boston Tea Party was the first real significant act of resistance that the colonists were putting against the crown. They had a few skirmishes before, there were some boycotts, but this was really the action that led towards the road to revolution. And there are a lot of misnomers that you might associate with the Boston Tea Party. Unlike these lovely little teacups, there was no party involved. There were no crumpets, no flowers. It was quite a significant moment where a bunch of colonists actually went to the Boston Harbor, boarded 3 ships, and dumped about 340 chests of tea into Boston Harbor one cold, rainy night. So that is the truth of what happened. But a lot of questions are around to why it happened, what was actually going on at that time. So let's just start at the very beginning, and I'll just put it out to you guys if you happen to remember, when you first heard about the Boston Tea Party, maybe in elementary school. What caused the Boston Tea Party? Taxes. That's the main thing. And that's the most memorable thing. But it wasn't just taxes, actually. Taxes had been around on tea for almost a decade before this. So something new had to happen, something that would really trigger colonists to take such a drastic movement. And so the question is, what would that be? And it really helps when we kind of shift our perspective and we think about the Boston Tea Party not as an action in itself, but it's more of a reaction to something else happening in the rest of the world and thinking about what's happening. And that really helps when you step back and think about what England was up to. And so here we have a map of what the British Empire looked in 1750. And you can see there's England in the middle, colored in red. They've got the British Isles. They also have some colonies and spaces in North America. But they're starting to get a little creative with the rest of the world, too. They've got some presence in South America, in Africa, and in India. And that's kind of the bright spot of the world at this point. India at this point had about 25% of global GDP. China had about another 50% of global GDP. So if you're a big empire and you're wanting to expand, that's where you want to put your next investment. And when you're looking at the trade that's coming back from Asia, you've got tea and silks and spices. All of that's being captured in Asia, being brought back to London, and then sold to the colonies. It works out pretty well. The colonists in America are loving their tea, they're enjoying their new spices, their food's tasting better, it's lasting longer. But you really have to think about, as an empire, what are they doing? And it's actually fascinating when you think about this map, because it says it's the British Empire, but it's not really the British Empire that's active in Asia at this point. At this point, it's actually being led by a private company. So imagine the foreign policy of the world being led by an Exxon or a Google instead. And that's kind of what's happening in Asia, which leads me to, of course, the British East India Company. They were one of the leading companies at the time. They were late to the game. Other companies had already come around, but eventually they became more prominent. And this is kind of how they saw themselves when they were in Asia. This is a company portrait. And it's kind of a weird portrait when you're thinking about a company. It's like a privately traded company. So why is there this one European guy 5 times the size of everybody else on a horse? Everyone else is kind of faceless, nameless behind him. This guy's clearly front and center. And what's really strange about this is that he's in a military uniform, which is not what you would think about for a private company. And when you think about the companies of the day, we kind of take it for granted that eventually they became these military, paramilitary troops taking over land and running it on their own. But it actually hadn't always begun that way. So if we step back even a little bit further, it actually all began with Queen Elizabeth, the first. And so you can see here's a picture of her, kind of later in her years. There's a picture of some ships in the back. So she actually granted the rights to the East India Company Charter, New Year's Eve, 1600. This was her definition of a party. Everyone else already has their companies out. The Dutch are doing it, the French are doing it. The Spanish and the Portuguese have already started exploring the world. They needed to get ahead of the game as well. So she started it, and it was kind of a new model for them. The British East India Company, welcome. Actually, it was basically a normal trading company in the beginning, but what was unusual is that it kind of reflects the companies of today. It was a joint stock corporation. So people like you and I could go out and put our money in, get some capital, and exploit the riches of the East while you're at it. It's a pretty sweet gig. And so they got a lot of free reign, they got a lot of prominence in London society at the time. So as they built up, they became more aggressive in their tactics, and eventually this military aspect that we saw in the beginning becomes much more prominent. And a key turning point is actually depicted in this painting, which is kind of hard to see, but this is called Shah Alam granting the Diwani. So that translates into there's a Mughal emperor in India at that time. He is in control of the wealthiest part of one of the wealthiest parts of the world. And he has just lost in battle to this company officer in red. So he's giving him a sheet of paper and says, you can control the taxes for my land. And back then, it's not like the taxes that all of us, I presume, have already filed tonight that are due tomorrow. It's much more complicated than using TurboTax. It would be company officers on the ground, managing the land, harassing the locals, being very aggressive, and actually punishing them for non-compliance. So imagine a private corporation like Shell going off to the coast of Mexico, fighting the local governor, taking over the mayor, planting a middle manager to run the jail. That's kind of what's happening over here in 1757 and 1765 in India. And this man in the middle here, he's actually hugely prominent, and his name is Robert Clive. So some of you might have heard of him or seen his statues in London. And the one picture here on the left is actually the big statue of Clive that's in London. He gets, prime billing. He's located right in Westminster, the seat of government, right by Buckingham Palace. This statue is basically right between the Foreign Office and the Treasury, and he's known as Clive of India. So everyone thinks he's a great guy. He really brought up the empire. But as you can see from his portrait, kind of hidden by the lighting here, he's in his military dress. So that's what he did. He was very aggressive, very ruthless when it came to actually running the company. And the foremost leading expert on the East India Company actually says, this guy is an unstable sociopath. Those are his words, not mine. At best, he's a bully. But he really changed the company around, really put them on the map. And he was thinking about the company. He didn't really have much of a background to himself, but he's growing up and he's thinking, this is how I can make my way. I can do corporate rating. No one's going to bat an eye. And as long as he brought the goods home for the company, which he did, he could take a little for himself, which he did, a lot. And he became essentially Europe's most prominent self-made man at that time. So corruption was huge, and that was kind of the ethos of the company at that time, because he wasn't the only one running away with things. All the company officers were, and they're all getting away with it. And it was kind of a piece of pride for them to show back home in London, look what I can do. Anyone can join the company. You can also be rich, and they'll let you go for it. So obviously the good times can't go on forever. And so there was a bit of bad luck and bad timing that came into play. So, just about 10 years after he got those amazing taxation rights, there was a huge drought in Bengal. And so the valuation of the company started looking a little bit rockier. People weren't really sure about the company's prospects. And then you have what's going on in stock markets. And these are phenomena that we're actually very comfortable talking about and hearing about today. But back then, it was a little bit harder to understand. So there's a huge drought in Bengal, 1770. The investors aren't really sure how the company is going to go, if they're going to be as successful as they say they are. So there's a couple of guys, they have a couple of wrong way bets on the market. Then there's actually a banking crisis in Europe that stems from that, from their bets and their view on how the company is going to deal with this crisis. But not to worry, Robert Clive's at the head, so by hook and by crook, he made it last, and things were okay for a couple of years, until people started getting worried. And then all of a sudden, the entire banking sector had a credit crisis, something that we all could relate to from 2008. And it was all of a sudden really hard for the company to actually get the loans. And so that fake crisis became a real crisis for the company. And that meant they had tens of thousands of pounds of tea just stuck in warehouses in Asia, starting to rot. It's not, a well-preserved commodity that they could get out. They needed to get it out. The value for that commodity was shrinking by the day as this crisis was happening. And so, as you might expect, they became the first too big to fail corporation. So this is actually their flag, and they actually were too big to fail. And this is something that we kind of know the response to. So what did they get? They got a bailout, right? And so the state stepped in, and in exchange for regulation and oversight, things had to change. They couldn't all be the Robert Clives of the world anymore. They had to kind of be quiet about their looting and their raiding and pillaging. But by that point, you could see the stock price is just plummeting, and this is just from like a historical context. So you can see the company is starting to shake, and the government really had to step in, because remember, this was a common stock corporation. So it wasn't just the people like Clive and his corrupt officers who were going to have to foot the bill. It was people like you and me. So the state needed to do something to bail them out and raise their revenues and get that stock of tea actually offloaded and into American colonies who were drinking tons and tons of tea. So the Crown really needed to think creatively about this, but they were also going through some challenging times. And now we'll kind of shift our focus to London to see what kind of questions that they had to deal with. So we've got the too big to fail corporate company. And at the same time, we also have what's going on in the rest of the world, which was known as the 7 Years' War. It had ended. We know it as the French-Indian War. It was extremely expensive. It was fought all over the world. There's a little map on the top left that just shows where all the fighting took around the world. It was huge. It was absolutely everywhere. And so then you have poor King George III. He's confused, picked up a new empire, lots of debt, got to deal with some bailouts and a credit crisis. What does he do? He needs to come up with some way to basically maintain the revenue, but he doesn't want to do it in a way that's going to be very provocative. Already in the colonies, we're starting to see some resistance. There were a first bout of taxes that were issued after the 7 Years' War. In the United States, that was known as the Townsend Acts. That led to the initial bouts of boycott and protesting. People in Boston were really rowdy. They burned down the governor's mansion, so they didn't want to go and do that again. So instead, they came up with something known as the Tea Act, which is over here and kind of blown up a little bit. And it's in kind of old-timey script. But what it basically says is that the company no longer needs to stop over in London to offload their tea and sell it to middlemen. They can go directly to the colonies, cut the middlemen, that'll cut the prices. They won't have to pay their taxes in London. That means the company will actually be able to sell their tea for cheaper prices And it does two things as well. So in addition to making the tea cheaper, it also makes it harder to smuggle because now you're getting it directly from your supplier, right? It's not coming from London and you're not carrying tea on different boats trying to figure out where is this boat from? Did the tea come from Holland? Did it come from Britain? And in the United States, smuggling was illegal. So they thought this was a great way to actually address a whole bunch of problems. But there really are no new taxes. The tax on tea had always been there. They're just doing a better job of enforcing it. But despite all that, that didn't go great in the United States for some people. It went well for some people because think about it. You have no middlemen in London. Now you need middlemen in the United States. And so you have your own haves and have-nots in the United States starting to emerge. And so these haves will be the friends of the company. They're the loyalists, the friends of the governor. So here we have a little picture in the small little corner, you can't really see it here, is Thomas Hutchinson. He's the one whose letters were on display in the Washington Post today. He said some not very nice things about the colonists and they weren't very happy about that. But the loyalists in Boston, they were very loyal to him. They're also related to him, that also helped. So he and his family not only ran the government, they also had their own tea merchant business. So of course they got a contract to be the special middleman for the company. He also had a daughter. She's in the blue dress here, surrounded by her lovely family. That's her father-in-law, Richard Clark, saying you can't sit with us. Richard Clark also got a deal with the company. So you get the idea of who's getting the deals with the company. There's only about 5 or 6 of them. And that you would think wouldn't be such a big problem in Boston because smuggling really wasn't that much of a problem. They were generally getting their tea through legitimate sources. But it did pose a problem for some very influential people, including for this guy who's been kind of shut into a corner. And does anyone recognize him? This guy over here. That's actually John Hancock. And so he... Yeah, of course, of course. Can everyone else hear me or should I speak even more? Okay, great. So John Hancock, he is a prominent citizen in Boston. He's a merchant. He may have been a smuggler. He was only charged once and he got a great lawyer to drop all the charges against him. That lawyer was John Adams. So you can see what kind of circle John Hancock is running in. And he obviously was part of the have-nots. He wanted to get a consignment. He couldn't. He had to go through these middlemen. They would charge more. And so you can imagine he's probably there grumbling and talking with his friends, John Adams, this is not really fair. And who else is in that circle besides John Adams' cousin, who is also extremely influential in Boston society? That's, of course, Samuel Adams. So it's a small circle of very influential, very connected people who are very much in tune with the moods of the day. So Samuel Adams, at this point, is the son of Sons of Liberty leaders. So they are the ones who are actually leading the protests, going out. Maybe they were the ones who burned down the governor's mansion before. Maybe that wasn't them. Maybe that was just some rabble-rousers. They're very good at not having their fingerprints anywhere. But Samuel Adams is the one who says, we need to do something about this. We can't stand for this kind of tyranny over us. It'll only get worse. So at first he tries to have reasonable negotiations and talk to the governor about it. But of course the governor needs to make the sale. His family, his family's company, they all benefit from the sale. So of course it doesn't go anywhere. And Sam Adams makes one last plea. Please, I need to have this tea not taxed at all. And so you have these East India tea brought over on 3 ships starting in late November of 1773. Their taxes must be paid by December 17th. By then, it's too late. Hutchins says these tea are going to stay. The taxes will be paid. They won't be impounded. And Samuel Adams says, okay, well, that's all I can do. And then somehow, mysteriously, after a big meeting, we don't know who the actual leader is, the Boston Tea Party happens. And so here we have a kind of public rendition of what the Boston Tea Party might have looked like. You'll see, lots of colonists kind of out screaming in the daytime, colonists disguised as Native Americans, bare-chested, feathers in their hat, dumping the tea overboard. That's completely false, by the way. This is how we think about the Tea Party. It was actually a very solemn event. It was quiet. Everyone participating knew that he could lose his life. So they were actually well covered up and covering themselves and in soot and in big blankets and big cloaks, disguising themselves. They were carrying tomahawks. They were calling themselves like the Mohawks to kind of align themselves with Lady Liberty, Americana. But it took under the cover of night. It was 3 hours long. They didn't destroy any other private property, just the tea and the tea chests themselves. And so there's always been this kind of fact blurred with fiction when it comes to the Tea Party. And that's why it's important, I think, to kind of look at this story and take the flip side. We can take some fiction and look at it with a little bit of fact as well, which brings me to my novel, The Tea Merchant. So unless there are any questions on the historical part, we can dive into the book. Yes?
I didn't understand this while I was reading the book, and I still don't fully understand. What was the problem?
The problem for the Tea Party?
Yeah, why were they so upset?
Yeah, so there's a few problems at play. So first were the taxes, which had always been there. So there is this undercurrent. They never liked those. So this had been an undercurrent for the past decade, ever since the 7 Years' War, and the Crown needed to impose these taxes. So keep in mind that Parliament was in London, and so the colonists in America didn't have a say. So you get the no taxation without representation. There's that. Two, they also created a monopoly on the trade. And so by cutting out those middlemen in London, the people you're actually cutting out are people from America who are working in London, getting their livelihood serving as the middlemen. And if you weren't a connected middleman and able to secure your family a consignment from the company, you were completely left out. And then third, it also cut out the smuggling. So in Boston, that was less of a problem. Actually, most people in Boston were law-abiding. They bought legal tea. It was a huge problem for the other parts of the colonies. New York and Philadelphia barely bought any legal tea. Most of it was smuggled through the Dutch. So it's the combination of those three things that just factor upon factor that really led to the tense, precipitate moment of the Boston Tea Party.
So could you just repeat, so what really tipped what caused the Tea Party right at the end was it John Hancock and his associates who wanted themselves to get consignment agreements and they weren't allowed to?
They wanted a freer market, and they also had the long-standing grievance about the taxation of that representation. So it's a new model of the Crown putting a company ahead of their own interests. And so all of that was coming together. And I'm sure there were people, they were reading the news, they knew what the company was doing in India. There was an element of fear as well as to what might happen. The reason why it happened on December 16th is that the taxes were due on December 17th. So,
who would pay those?
So basically, the tea would be impounded, and that would be going against the sales. So they would collect the tax revenues from the tea and then sell it from the consignees who refused to resign. So those 6 people in the friends and family plan, they would still get the tea, and they would still sell it to everybody else. So people still wanted their tea. There was a boycott, but at the end of the day, they still wanted their tea. They just didn't want a monopoly on it, and they didn't want taxes on it. Yeah.
Well, there were 2 things that I didn't understand. So it sounded like you talked about the middlemen over in England, but it sounded in the book, it sounded like there were a lot of people who were independent sellers selling tea, that some from some other country, countries and stuff, but some English tea.
Yes.
And they just lost their license to do it. So were there a lot of people who lost their business because this company came in and took their business over? That's one question. And the other thing is, what was the role? I mean, I certainly never heard it, because I grew up in Boston and lived there for 70 years.
Okay.
I never heard anything about opium.
Yes.
Being involved.
Yes.
And I wanted to know if that was true too.
Yes, so the exact number of middlemen in Boston who lost their jobs in London, I don't have a good figure for that, but I do know that they did have agents in London. And by any reasonable count, it would have been bigger than the 6 people in Boston who got the consignment. So there would have been a larger network that would be losing from here. The opium angle, for those of you who haven't read the book, so if you're thinking about what's actually growing in India at this time, it's not tea. Tea doesn't grow in India at this time. It's starting in the 1800s, really, when that picks up. What is growing up in India is opium. And that has a darker history to it. We're getting a little bit ahead in the book as well. It's kind of part of the exploration of what all dynamics are happening. But we were starting to connect the dots about what grows in India, grows well, quickly, as another great cash crop from the perspective of the company, and it is opium. And they're using that and actually using the opium to trade in Asia to procure the tea, which is not yet grown in India itself. And so there is a darker undercurrent of the kind of risks that the company will have and their type of business practices. So I hope that helps answer that question.
But are they pushing the opium in Massachusetts? That's my.
No, so this is all fiction on that part. So that's kind of towards the end, surprise. But this is all happening in India at that point. The only opium that I know that was allowed into the United States at that point would have been in the form of laudanum, which was a painkiller that was very popular. So laudanum was definitely coming in, but I'm not sure about, the gray scary opium that we know and think about. Yep.
Do you think that the opium that was being grown and forced to grow in India, did that cause the famine in Bengal?
I don't think so, actually. So I was reading about this, and apparently it was just a series of bad rain, and the land had gotten exhausted because opium is, you have to turn it over, the land is getting exhausted, you can't have the rotations of the crops. That is there. But I'm not sure if it was that alone that caused the drought. It had happened over a couple of years. So there was a big drought alongside this opium growing business. And the way that the company ran their actual land revenue management was that if your land is devastated and you are poor and you can't pay and you've died, essentially, your neighbor has to pay that. So your problem became someone else's problem, and everyone else starts growing these crops that are not feeding you or the population. It's exhausting your land instead. So it did become that bad of a problem. Okay.
Yes. Why did you take the format of fiction as opposed to nonfiction?
Yeah, thank you. This is the perfect segue. I was going to actually use it for this slide. So
I worked for a publishing company.
there we go.
It's a plan.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why, when I first learned about this topic, it's not really new news. This has been around, people know about this, but it struck a chord with me because it was the first time I was able to connect the dots from different parts of geographies, different types of people. And when I was thinking about it, at first it would be just like a fiction, like a historical blog post might be the right way to talk about this. But then me growing up in Boston, I got a sense that there was this history all around me, but I didn't really have a way to connect with it. And this bigger picture of the empire, that's how I could get a say to put my voice into it. And I kind of wanted to bring that history of the East into Boston and make it front and center in a way that was much more implicit at the time. At the time, there were references to the East. People knew different languages. There were goods and spices coming through. They knew about the East India Company. But at the end of the day, the East India Company was not in Boston. And that's one thing that I really wanted to play with in this novel, really bring the threat of the company into the city. And I do that by actually having 2 company officers come to Boston and be horrible and fantastic villains for me to write about. But that's really why I chose this format. It was my chance to put my story and my family's story, originally from India, into the story. And as I started doing some digging, I realized it wasn't just my story that I could put into it. There were lots of other stories that were going on. And I wanted to play with that and kind of have them all interplay with each other. And that's why I called it, diversity matters in The Tea Merchant. It's not just...
Where in India is your family?
My family's from North India, and my parents are here, my sister's here as well.
From where?
New Delhi.
Oh.
But we also have family...
I've been to India 4
Okay.
times. So.
Okay, there we go. But I also have family in Bengal. I also have family in Bombay. My mom, she grew up all over India, so pretty much a global citizen of India as well. So we've been hearing about India and its role and its east to west kind of connections for a long time, but I wasn't seeing it when I was growing up in Massachusetts. Those of you who grew up in New England will see, you celebrate the Patriots a lot. Today actually is Patriots Day. It's a state holiday in Massachusetts. They celebrate the memory of the battles of Lexington and Concord. That's starting this week. It's a commemoration. Paul Revere, his anniversary of his ride is tomorrow night. That's why the Boston Marathon happens on Patriots Day today. So there's a lot of Paul Revere and Samuel Adams and John Hancock. There's very little about the East India Company when we're there. So that's where we get into the diversity. So I'll just kind of walk through some of the elements of the diversity that I was able to explore. in the novel. And it didn't even begin with me. It began through the different kinds of papers I was out reading when I was taking this global approach. And the first was like a weird realization that this was actually America's first civil war in many respects, the Revolutionary War. We have people sharing one home, families. They're on very opposite sides of the debate. And in the context of this book, we're not yet at the patriots level. They're still sons of liberty. They're not full-on patriots. They haven't really thought about independence yet, but they're moving in that direction. And so all these debates are happening at home. All of us in DC, we deal with partisan politics all the time. We hear it everywhere. It's kind of that kind of tension that is all around us and has always been around us. And that's something that I wanted to explore in the book as well. So yes, they have a lot of differences. They're fighting on different sides. Sometimes they have different interests, but at the end of the day, they're neighbors, they're family members. They're dealing with this at a very personal level. And fiction was really helpful in helping me explore that as well. And then the next area where diversity matters was, of course, women. We all hear about the Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams, boycotts, Boston Tea Party, but there were also the Daughters of Liberty. So a lot of what the Sons wanted to do wouldn't have been effective without the Daughters. And these are women who were organized units within themselves, but there was no clear leader as far as I've been able to find out so far. I've only ever found maybe one portrait of one woman who might have been a Daughter of Liberty at a museum in Philadelphia. But at the end of the day, for a boycott of tea, for example, to work, it's the women who had to make sure that their pantry stayed empty of it. And so this is the best picture I could find of a Daughter of Liberty, which is kind of shocking. And so I wanted to play with that and have my characters form that little circle of a Daughter of Liberty. And then, of course, we're talking about diversity. We're talking about heritage, East and West coming together. And so we're thinking about people at that time and their mentality, and they're very much thinking about their interests. They're thinking about where they can grow, where they can really find new opportunities for themselves. And for them, for a lot of them, it was in the East. So you have these Western people looking to the East for their own exploitations, their own growth. And this really came home to me on a family trip that we took to Bengal actually a few years ago. And it kind of all came together when we visited the Victoria Memorial in Bengal. So that's the Victoria Memorial. It's huge. I think it's the biggest landmark to a monarch, perhaps on the planet. And you can see it kind of looks like the Capitol meets the Taj Mahal. So you can see this blending of cultures starting to come in. And it's interesting because it's always visionary. So it's the memorial to Queen Victoria, but she never went to India. And you step inside, and who's there is not anyone who actually worked for the government. It's Robert Clive. That's his statue, smack in the middle of the room. So everyone's trying to read about their local history, and it's kind of strange to have Robert Clive in there, Clive of India, the one who looted and marauded and pillaged the country. It would be like seeing a statue of George III on Pennsylvania Avenue, I think. It'd be kind of strange. But this is how the history blends together, and it's still alive today. And so in this book, people are kind of looking to the East, and what they're doing is actually bringing things back from the East as well. And they're bringing back both ideas and concrete things as well. So just keep in mind, in the 1770s, we're in the age of enlightenment. Our founding fathers are looking to the rest of the world. They're looking to the classics, trying to understand different strategies. They're looking for historical documents that they can use for themselves to stand up for themselves. And that includes strategy, including strategy that they play over different chessboards. So that's a chessboard that's actually a replica of what both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison have at their own homes. If you go to Monticello, if you go to Madison's house, you'll see a chess set that looks just like that. And chess was a game that started in India. So you're starting to see this openness to new ideas. And then it's also very tangible. So here we have a picture of the crown jewels of England and the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond in it. It's still a matter of debate. I understand the Koh-i-Noor will not be on display at the coronation on May 6th, but that in itself is also spurring debate. So this tension between what do we take from the East, how do we bring it back, how do we talk about it, how do we incorporate it in our day-to-day, that is still very valid. And so that also comes to play a role in the story as well. For those of you who have read the book will understand some of the references to the diamonds that I'm talking here. And then, of course, we're talking about why do we need to think about history, all of our stories today? Because it does matter. So again, we're leading up to the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party. in Boston and Massachusetts, and perhaps soon nationwide, there will be a lot of efforts to kind of draw attention to the matter. There is a group of people who will take pride in participating in that event. But it's also important to remember that this is also all of our stories. It's not just limited to the people who were dumping, 340 chests of tea into Boston Harbor on that rainy night. It has to do with all of us. It has to do with all of our stories. And that's why it's important to think about that when you're reading these articles, you're reading the Washington Post, or celebrating Patriots Day. It really is important to step back and think about where did we come from and how we all got here together. So with that, I'll take a pause. I think we have about 20 minutes for an open discussion about the book. So I'll just leave it for you. And then afterwards, there will be a book signing and book sales as well. So, thank you. Thank you. All right. Yeah.
I have something that's sort of tangential. I'm a gardener and I have a beautiful plant that's called Clivia. And it's also known as the South African lily, and it was discovered by an English botanist whose patron was Lady Clive. And I never knew anything else about her until tonight, which is, so thank you. And it's a beautiful plant. It's related to the amaryllis for other gardeners. And it has a beautiful, and in South Africa, you see it as practically a hedge. It's so prolific and beautiful. So thank you for the...
No, and it kind of opens your... Yeah. There's a lot more books coming out about, revisiting the company and what their roles actually were. So it's pretty bad, but the good part is that it does open, you learn about different flowers. It does open your eyes to see where these connections are. You'll generally see them when you're traveling around Europe, and I think in Scotland and Ireland in particular, there were a lot of people from the company. They were the ones who went. If you're thinking about English politics at that point, the Scots had lost Culloden, they had lost their identity, so a lot of them joined the company, and then they brought all that treasure back with them. So there is amazing palaces and manors filled with wonderful relics from the East. The British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, they are beautiful places where you'll probably find the best preserved Indian history, even outside of India. Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about sort of how you went about going about figuring out the history and like the research, and like did you visit different museums or places, and if you could also maybe share like one super interesting fact that you learned that really kind of surprised you.
Yeah. So it's a bit of both. So I wrote this book in like the peak pandemic. I wasn't going anywhere, so I thought I'd write. That was pretty much the only thing I could do. So there was a lot of research that was happening virtually. And fortunately, a lot of information has been digitized, so I was able to get into the British archives, the French archives. A lot of this is online. In the back of the book, you'll see about 4 pages of references. Most of them I accessed digitally. But also the library. Libraries have been huge. I didn't buy a single book, which is probably a bad sales pitch, but I did check out dozens and dozens of books from the library throughout the pandemic. And then, as you mentioned, I grew up in very historic places throughout my whole life. So history's always been around me, and I was always interested in it. And this idea actually fell into my head in Virginia after this trip to India that I took, when I'd been learning about the company. And I'm in Clarendon, I'm in a bookstore, and I see a book about the company, and I see a book about the Boston Tea Party, and I said, wait a minute, these are connected. No one's really putting these connections together, and that's how it all started. And in terms of an interesting fact, I didn't know that tea didn't grow in India originally. I thought it was all over. I thought it had always been there. But no, it really only started in late 1773 when they really started expanding their propagation of tea there. And they took it elsewhere too, right? It's all over Africa as well. But back then, China was the main producer of tea. Cool, yeah.
Can you share a little bit about your main lead, Constance? Like, you have a strong female character as your lead. What is it that you love most about her?
What I love about Constance is that she knows herself. There are a lot of competing pieces for her attention, whether it's family members, it's friends, it's business interests, it's society. There are a lot of different voices coming to her, but she always checks in with herself and says, does this feel right? Is what I'm doing really risky? Is it worth it? So it's good to have that kind of strong woman featured in a historical novel of this time. which is kind of unusual too. When I was starting to look into this topic, I wanted to find a book about a woman in this period. And I literally went to all the libraries and I said, where are historical fiction set in colonial America with women? And I got 90 books about witches. And that was it. That was it. I couldn't find anything about revolutionary women. And so I had to come up with my own. And so you have to have that strong sense of self before you can really go out and become a revolutionary. And so that's what I really love about her.
How long did it take you to write this?
It took 1 year for the first draft, and then I went back to work, so then it took 3 more years after that. Yeah. Cool.
Is this the first time that you've written on this period of history?
Yes, so it's my first time writing about this period. It's my first published novel. I have another novel that I've written sitting on my computer, but that's like a modern thriller, so this is my first time. But historical fiction's always been my preferred reading. I've always loved reading about this particular era. I'm pretty typical in the sense that I love everything about Jane Austen as well, so I've read all those books, seen all those adaptations. So it did help in terms of the language. Some of the feedback that I got is that the language felt pretty natural, and it's maybe because I spend all my time watching period dramas, but that's why the historical fiction for this period actually was much easier for me to tap into. I don't think I could have done the same thing with, for example, the Civil War.
Are you thinking about a sequel, or did you think this book is pretty tied up nicely with the book?
Oh, there was a big, as far as I was, there were big cliffhangers at the end.
There are some cliffhangers, and I know some people who would have liked the ending to be a little bit different too. So I'm thinking about it. There's plenty of research to continue on the themes about connecting the dots. And yes, there might be something. But honestly, when it came to the Boston Tea Party, that was the cleanest hook between East and West. And that's what really gripped me from the beginning. So I'm still trying to find that kind of hook for a sequel. So hopefully. Cool. Yeah.
On the very first page, there was I was curious about it. You had her going to the mailbox on the fence.
Yes.
Did they have mailboxes on the fence in 1773?
I think they had letter boxes. So that it's more like that. It's just kind of like a nondescript little pocket where you could go in and take a piece of paper. But creative license is great, so I ran with it. Cool.
What was one of the biggest challenges you had while writing the book?
Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges was kind of like taking myself to the next chapter. I had a roadmap for the entire book at the beginning, but then as you write each chapter, you see the character kind of becoming their own person, and you kind of go with the character as they're being formed with you rather than what you had before. So I would oftentimes end a chapter and I said, okay, great, now what? I had this planned, but this guy I thought was a villain is actually a pretty nice guy, so let me switch some things around. And you just kind of daydream for a while to figure out where the next part of the book should go. And when you look back at the outline, it's completely different from where it originally started. But it's nice to have those markers along the way, but it's very easy to get lost in between. And I had to kind of embrace that uncertainty, because that's really what the characters were doing and telling me instead. Cool. Yeah.
So this is more a comment, I guess, because you respond to that. My views of the Boston Tea Party has evolved as I grew up. Because when you first get it at elementary school, that short little thing, you get one view. They really say that history is written by the winners, right? Mm-hmm. And the more I learned about the Boston Tea Party as I grew older, it began to bother me more and more that we only saw one side of the story. Mm-hmm. And it was maybe a selfish act by the patriots, right? That, your book kind of plays up a lot of that, because I always thought about, I never connected, the East in who they were, but I always knew that they were like these businessmen who got ripped off because of this, right? And part of it was the whole idea is that, government costs money, and the defense of the colonists during the French and Indian War, which was really a world war, cost a lot of money, not only for not only in terms of the pounds, but in life and liberty and life and, live. And after, taking the benefit, the colonists taking the benefit of the British coming in across the ocean, spending all this money and losing all these people's lives, they weren't going to pay for it. I was like, okay, fine, we're not going to pay for all of this. And it always seems to be a kind of a selfish act. The more, and you would go to these different, museums and, and you would read the little blurb they would have about and they're all a little different and they're changing now.
Yes.
So, everybody looks at the Tea Party deal. I mean, I always thought that the appropriation of the term the Tea Party recently was they didn't understand it at all. They're kind of using this and they don't really understand what it was all about. I guess it's so if you have any comments on that?
No, that's actually fascinating because the Tea Party has always been kind of misunderstood. And you're right, we only get it maybe one lesson in elementary school, maybe a minute in history class in high school, and then you breeze right on by. But I do think there is this moment now where a lot of people are going back to history and revisiting it. That's happening a lot with respect to slavery in particular. I've gone to Mount Vernon several times, you go to Monticello, all these places, and you see the signs have changed. They're trying to tell more stories, more inclusive stories about who all was affected. So that is starting to get there. But you're right, I mean, the Boston Tea Party at the end of the day was destruction of private property. And that was a big question that the colonists had at the time. Like, do we really want to go and do this? It's an illegal act that we're doing. And there was a lawsuit. The company sued. They tried to get their money back. I forget if they actually did or not, but I don't think they did. But you're right, it was a huge act. And I think this always begs the question of who is telling us this story, right? What are the full stories? What happens at the end of the day? Why is it happening? It's not only an action, it's a reaction to something. And that is something that I think we can always carry with us. And that, I think, is something that we're going to be keeping in mind as the 250th of the revolution itself takes place. There's going to be a lot of talk about what happened at each of these battles. But you scratch the surface and the Patriots are doing just as dirty things as the Loyalists and the Brits. So it's hard to draw a clear side. And when we go back to that question of America's first Civil War, when we think about the revolution, we kind of take it for granted that everyone wanted to do this. But I think only about 20 to 30% of people were fully on board. There was a lot of gray space. There was maybe another third or so who didn't want it. A lot of people actually went back to Britain as a result. That picture I showed in the earlier part of the presentation with the family, that was painted by John Copley, so everyone from the New England area will know John Singleton Copley. That was his family. He married that daughter. He has a self-portrait of himself in there, and they all went back to England at the end of the day, and John Singleton Copley is buried in England today.
Do you even know who started calling it the Tea Party?
The Tea Party? I do not know.
What that term came from?
I don't remember. I know at this time it was actually called the destruction of the tea back then. It was pretty plain and boring. But my hunch is that they needed some rebranding for some patriotic cause, maybe a few decades down the road.
Party in Boston,
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. You can feel free to connect with me on social media if you like. I'm on there tweeting all different kinds of things about the Tea Party. You can probably glean from my tweets and retweets where the sequel might be heading as well. But there's a pretty nice group of historical fanatics who are tweeting in this little circle, and T1773 is my hashtag. So feel free to engage with me on different parts of social media. And again, the books are available for sale. I'll sign them, but please feel free to take some snacks along the way as well.